Hey Sarah, I've always been curious about the history of Alberta, especially the Indigenous peoples who have lived there for thousands of years. Do you know much about it?
Hi, Alex. Yes, I do. Alberta's history is rich and diverse, and the Indigenous peoples have played a significant role in shaping the province. It's a fascinating topic. Where would you like to start?
Well, let's begin with the Indigenous peoples. Who were the first inhabitants of what we now call Alberta, and when did they arrive?
The first inhabitants of Alberta were Indigenous peoples who have a deep and complex history in the region. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence suggests human presence dating back over 12,000 years, with various groups such as the Clovis and Folsom cultures. However, the ancestors of today's Indigenous peoples in Alberta have been here for at least 8,000 years.
That's quite a long time. Can you tell me more about these Indigenous groups?
Absolutely. Alberta is home to several Indigenous nations and tribes, each with its unique culture and history. Some of the prominent Indigenous groups in the province include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Dene, and Piikani, the Cree, the Dene, and the Nakoda, Stoney Nakoda. These groups have deep-rooted traditions, languages, and spiritual practices that have been passed down for generations.
It's incredible how diverse the Indigenous cultures in Alberta are. What were their traditional ways of life like before European contact?
Before European contact, the Indigenous peoples of Alberta had diverse and sustainable ways of life adapted to their environments. The Plains Indigenous groups, like the Blackfoot, relied on buffalo hunting for sustenance, clothing, and shelter. The Cree were skilled traders and hunters, while the Dene, who lived in the northern forests, were expert hunters and trappers.
I've heard about the buffalo being crucial to Plains Indigenous cultures. What happened to their way of life when European settlers arrived? European contact had a profound impact on Indigenous peoples in Alberta. The introduction of firearms, horses, and European diseases significantly altered their traditional lifestyles. The buffalo, which was central to Plains Indigenous cultures, faced rapid decline due to overhunting by settlers. This led to food shortages and forced many Indigenous groups onto reserves.
That sounds like a challenging time for the Indigenous peoples. Did they resist or negotiate with European settlers in any way?
Yes, they did. Indigenous peoples in Alberta, like across North America, engaged in both resistance and negotiation. There were instances of armed conflicts, such as the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, led by Métis leader Louis Riel, and the Blackfoot's resistance to the signing of Treaty 7. But there were also negotiations, like the signing of treaties, where Indigenous leaders sought to protect their rights in land.
So, these treaties were a way to address some of the issues. Can you tell me more about them?
Certainly. In the late 19th century, the Canadian government negotiated a series of treaties with Indigenous peoples in Alberta, including Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8. These treaties were agreements that outlined certain rights, such as access to reserved land, education, and health care, in exchange for Indigenous peoples' surrender of land rights. However, there have been historical disputes over the interpretation and implementation of these treaties.
It's crucial to understand the complexity of these treaties and their impact. What about the 20th century? How did things evolve for Indigenous peoples in Alberta during that time?
The 20th century brought significant changes for Indigenous peoples in Alberta. There was a push for assimilation through policies like the residential school system, which forcibly removed Indigenous children from their families to eradicate their culture and language. This had devastating and intergenerational impacts.
The residential school system is a dark chapter in Canadian history. Did Indigenous communities in Alberta find ways to preserve their culture despite these challenges?
Yes, despite immense challenges, Indigenous communities in Alberta have shown remarkable resilience in preserving their cultures. They've worked tirelessly to revitalize their languages, traditions, and ceremonies. Initiatives like cultural centers, powwows, and educational programs have played a vital role in preserving and celebrating their heritage.
It's heartening to hear about their resilience. How has the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples evolved in recent years?
In recent years, there has been a significant shift in the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples. The recognition of Indigenous rights, as affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, and landmark legal cases like the Supreme Court's Lockhart decision have strengthened Indigenous land and self-determination rights.
That's promising. Are there any ongoing issues or challenges that Indigenous communities in Alberta are still facing today?
Absolutely. There are still challenges. Issues such as poverty, inadequate housing, and access to clean water persist in many Indigenous communities. Land disputes and environmental concerns, particularly regarding resource development on Indigenous lands, also continue to be pressing issues.
It's crucial that these issues are addressed. What steps are being taken to address them?
There's ongoing dialogue and negotiation between Indigenous communities, the provincial government, and the federal government to address these issues. Land claims and resource revenue sharing agreements are being negotiated to ensure that Indigenous communities benefit from resource development on their traditional lands. Reconciliation efforts, education, and awareness campaigns are also helping to bridge gaps and foster understanding.
Reconciliation is a significant step forward. As we wrap up this discussion, it's clear that Alberta's history, especially concerning its Indigenous peoples, is both rich and complex. It's vital that we continue to learn, engage, and support efforts toward reconciliation and understanding.
Absolutely, Alex. Understanding this history and acknowledging the contributions and resilience of Indigenous peoples is essential for a more inclusive and equitable future for all in Alberta and beyond.